Welcome to Candlelight Mystery, where every night brings a new tale of suspense, secrets, and hidden clues. Sit back, relax, and let the glow of mystery guide you through unforgettable stories. From classic detectives to modern enigmas, we bring you soothing, immersive mysteries for the perfect bedtime escape. Beneath the glittering chandeliers of Ravenhurst Manor lies a secret older than its walls, a secret hidden inside a simple, ancient silver spoon. When Miss Marple and Hercule Poirot are invited to a charity dinner, they sense something far darker than polite smiles and fine conversation. Whispers of a curse drift through the halls, an argument erupts behind locked doors, and by midnight the silver spoon vanishes without a trace. But this is no ordinary theft. It's a puzzle of greed, betrayal, and a forgotten map, and only two legendary detectives can uncover the truth before the past strikes again. Chapter 1. The Mysterious Invitation. Hercule Poirot did not like the English winter. Rain, in his opinion, should either commit itself nobly as a storm or retreat altogether. This endless grey mist, this half-hearted drizzle that clung to his immaculate overcoat and flattened his moustaches, was an insult to good taste and to symmetry. He stood under the modest awning of the small London building where he now resided, watching the driver secure his suitcase to the back of a waiting motor-car. "A weekend in the country," he murmured to himself. "It sounds charming, does it not, Poirot? The fresh air, the peace, the quiet, and, above all, the excellent English cooking." He paused. "If you are fortunate." The invitation lay folded with almost military precision in his gloved hand. Heavy cream paper, embossed with an old family crest, a rampant lion, a shield, and curiously a delicate silver spoon engraved beneath. The letter had been written in a neat hand, formal, but with an undercurrent of urgency. "Monsieur Poirot, I would be honored if you would accept an invitation to spend the weekend at Willowbank Hall, my family home, in the countryside. I have recently come into possession of an heirloom known within my family as the silver spoon, an object to which clings a history of misfortune. Several strange incidents have already occurred, and I fear there is more to come. I am told you specialize in such matters. Your presence would be of immense reassurance. Yours, faithfully, Edward Langdon." "The silver spoon," Poirot repeated softly. "A strange thing, to be afraid of one small piece of cutlery." Still, there had been something about the letter that piqued his curiosity, something between superstition and calculation, and Poirot was not a man to ignore an interesting puzzle. The driver closed the boot with a decisive bang. "All set, sir," he said. "Willowbank Hall, right? Long drive, that. We'll want to get ahead of the fog." Poirot nodded and was about to step forward when a Poirot second car drew up to the curb, braking with a soft squeal. It was an older model, well kept but not ostentatious, with a driver who had the slightly harassed look of one who has spent his life navigating narrow lanes and impossible schedules. From the rear door emerged a small, neatly dressed, elderly lady, carefully clutching a handbag and a folded umbrella. She wore a sensible hat and a tweed coat that looked as though it had seen many winters and faced them all with quiet perseverance. Poirot recognized her at once, though they had only crossed paths in the most casual of ways before. Miss Jane Marple, of Street Mary Mead. She did not immediately see him. Her attention was fixed on the driver, whom she thanked with a gentle smile and a coin pressed into his hand. Only then did she turn, and her eyes widened the merest fraction at the sight of him. "Why, Monsieur Poirot," she said, surprise mingling with pleasure. "What an unexpected coincidence." "Miss Marple," Poirot bowed slightly, removing his hat. "The pleasure is mine, though whether it is a coincidence, I am not so certain." Her blue eyes twinkled. "No? Well, I suppose one should never assume too much in this world. Things have a way of being arranged." She glanced at his suitcase, then at the car, and finally at the folded paper in his hand. Her gaze lingered on the embossed crest. "Willowbank Hall?" she asked mildly. Poirot's eyebrows rose. "You are quick to observe, mademoiselle. It is, Indeed so. How interesting, she said. I am going there myself. She produced from her handbag a letter almost identical to his, the same crest, the same cream paper, only the name and address differed, and where his letter was addressed to Monsieur Hercule Poirot, hers was to Miss Jane Marple. Poirot's eyes narrowed with interest. "Ah," he said softly. "Now, this is most intriguing. Mr. Langdon, Edward Langdon, that is, was a distant connection of my late cousin Mildred," Miss Marple explained. "Such things do happen in families, little knots of people scattered about the poor country, all faintly related and all faintly surprised when they remember it. He wrote that he found himself in a difficulty and would value my opinion. Such a polite young man." She trailed off, her expression thoughtful. "And he speaks to you also of this silver spoon?" Poirot asked. "He stows." "Does indeed. Says it has brought nothing but trouble to his family. I dare say that is the kind of thing people say when they wish to excuse their own behaviour, but," her lips pressed together, the tone of the letter did suggest genuine anxiety. Poirot gestured to his own car. "It seems, then, that we are summoned to the same stage for the same performance. Perhaps we should travel together? It is always well, when investigating matters of superstition, to have a sensible companion." Miss Marple smiled. "I am not sure how sensible I am, Monsieur Poirot, but I assure you I am very used to people behaving most unwisely indeed." They arranged their luggage with the driver, who regarded the shared journey as a practical inconvenience solved, and soon they were seated side by side in the back of the car as London's grey streets gave way to the wider roads leading out into the Sting countryside. For a time they rode in companionable silence. The city thinned, houses giving way to hedgerows and bare trees. The sky hung low and colourless, and the fields on either side were drenched in a dull, damp light. "Tell me, Miss Marple," Poirot said at last, "does this business of the silver spoon interest you?" "Oh, yes," she replied. "Very much. Families are very interesting, you know, especially old families with large houses and a great many secrets. It is extraordinary how often a small object can become a symbol of all manner of feelings: greed, resentment, envy. People attach their emotions to things and then blame the things when misfortune follows." "You do not believe in a curse, then?" She shook her head. "I have seen a great many supposed curses, Monsieur Poirot. They generally turn out to be human nature in a different dress." Poirot smiled faintly. "On that, mademoiselle, we are in complete agreement." He unfolded the letter again, reading part of it aloud. "To which clings a history of misfortune," he repeated. "It is curious how the English love such phrases. They are romantic, but they conceal nothing of use." "Stories grow," Miss Marple said gently, "especially in the country. Someone loses money, someone else falls ill, a quarrel happens, and all of a sudden there is a tale that the objects in the house are unlucky. It gives people something to talk about, and talking, in villages, is as necessary as air." Poirot chuckled. "You speak with the authority of experience." "Oh, yes," she said. "One sees these things in a small village. People are much the same everywhere, of course, but in a village you see them more closely. There is nowhere to hide." Poirot looked out of the window. In the distance, the faint outline of a large house appeared on a low rise, framed by skeletal trees. As they drew nearer, the house gained substance, a long, elegant building of pale stone, its many windows reflecting the grey light. The drive curved upwards between manicured lawns and drooping shrubs. "Willowbank Hall," the driver announced over his shoulder. "Not many visitors this time of year. Looks a bit lonely in the winter, if you ask me." Poirot studied the house with a critical eye. "It has a melancholy," he observed, "a certain sadness in the lines. Do you see, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple's gaze was fixed on the upper windows. "Yes," she said quietly, "it does look sad, and perhaps a little frightened too, as if it knows something we do not." Poirot gave her a sharp, approving glance. "An interesting observation," he murmured. The car came to a smooth halt at the front steps. The great door stood half open, as though the house itself were drawing breath. A figure appeared in the doorway, a man in his early 30s, tall with dark hair and a face that might have been handsome had it not been so strained. He came down the steps quickly as the driver opened the car door. "Miss Marple, Monsieur Poirot?" he asked, his voice eager, almost anxious. "Yes," Poirot replied, stepping out with care. "You are Mr. Edward Langdon?" "I am. I can't tell you how grateful I am that you both agreed to come." Miss Marple emerged next, leaning slightly on her umbrella as she steadied herself on the gravel. "Such a long journey," she said kindly, "but I always think it is worth it to see a new garden, and I understand your house has a great many stories to tell." Langdon's expression flickered. "You could say that," he murmured. "Please, come inside. There's so much I need to." "Explain." Poirot exchanged a brief look with Miss Marple. Between them passed, in that glance, a wordless understanding. Whatever lay behind the polite invitation and the talk of family heirlooms was not a simple matter. They followed Edward Langdon into the shadowed hall of Willowbank, the door closing softly behind them. The house, it seemed, had swallowed them whole. The entrance hall of Willowbank Hall was grand without being ostentatious. Dark panelling rose halfway up the walls, giving way to pale, once cream wallpaper now dimmed with age. A chandelier, festooned with prisms, hung above a patterned rug whose colours had faded to gentle browns and blues. On a long oak table near the wall, a vase of winter roses drooped, their pale petals bruised at the edges. Miss Marple took all this in with a quick, practised glance. She also noticed the faint track of mud on the end tray, tiles near the door, the missing coat hook on the stand, and the umbrella leaning against the wall in a careless, almost abandoned way. Edward Langdon closed the door behind them and turned with a tight smile. "I'm afraid the house is not at its best," he said. "We've had a difficult few months. Tendable ride present as accused." Poirot removed his gloves, smoothing the fingers with precise motions. "The house, it is like a face, Monsieur Langdon. It reveals much when one knows how to look. But perhaps you will show us to a place where we may talk?" "Of course. The drawing-room. This way, please." As they moved along the corridor, Miss Marple walked a little behind the two men, her eyes flitting over the details. The family portraits on the walls, some hung straight, some askew, the polished but slightly scratched banister, a door at the far end standing ajar, with just a glimpse of shelves, perhaps a library. One portrait in particular caught her attention. A young woman, early 20s perhaps, with dark hair and a strong, determined face. The artist had painted her holding something small and silver in her hand, though time and varnish had blurred the details. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "Your family, Mr. Langdon?" she asked, pausing. Edward glanced back. "Yes, that's my great-aunt Helena," he said. "She died before I was born. My grandmother used to say she brought the first trouble into the house." His tone suggested he was repeating a phrase he did not quite believe, but could not entirely dismiss. "And is that the silver spoon she is holding?" Poirot asked. Edward hesitated, then nodded. "I believe so. At least, that's what the story says." They entered the drawing-room, a large but comfortable room with tall windows and heavy curtains tied back to admit the grey daylight. A fire burned in the grate, the flames lending a flicker of warmth to the otherwise cool light. "Please sit," Edward said, gesturing to a pair of armchairs. "I'll ring for tea. Things are always easier to explain over tea." Miss Marple smiled approvingly. "I have found that to be quite true," she said. "A great many problems in life become clearer with a pot of tea and a quiet half-hour." When the servant, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a careful manner, had been summoned and departed again, Edward remained standing, as though uncertain where to begin. Poirot watched him thoughtfully. "Perhaps, Monsieur Langdon," he suggested, "you will tell us first what has happened of late, and then what has happened before. The present is often the key to understanding the past." Edward ran a hand through his hair. Yes, that's reasonable. It's just broke off, then started again. Have either of you ever felt that something in a house is wrong, as though everything is slightly off balance? I have felt that some people are wrong, Poirot replied. Very often, the house merely reflects them. Miss Marple nodded. Houses can be unhappy, in a way. They absorb what happens in them, but it is usually people who cause the unhappiness, not bricks and mortar. Edward gave a short, humourless laugh. In that case, we have had some very unhappy people at Willowbank. He moved nearer the fire, holding out his hands to the warmth as though steadying himself. It started 3 months ago, he said. I inherited Willowbank from my Uncle Henry when he died suddenly. It was not expected, at least, not so soon. My uncle was only in his 50s. Everyone thought he would live to a ripe old age and complain about it. He lived here. Alone? Poirot asked. Not entirely. There is Mrs. Green, the housekeeper, who has been here nearly 30 years, a maid, Alice, a gardener who comes from the village, and my cousin Clara. She stayed here often. She was almost like a daughter to him. Were you close to your uncle? Miss Marple asked. Edward's face tightened. Not particularly. There was some history between him and my father, old grievances. I visited as a boy, but as I grew older, we drifted apart. When I did come, I always had the sense that Willowbank was waiting for something. It sounds fanciful, I know. Not at all, Miss Marple said gently. Children often sense things more clearly than adults. When I inherited the house, Edward went on, I discovered that Uncle Henry had been obsessed with this damned silver spoon for years. He had it locked away in a safe in the library, along with papers, diaries, old letters. He'd been tracing its history, every death, every quarrel, every piece of bad luck the family had suffered. He linked to it somehow. He believed the spoon was cursed. And you? Poirot asked. Do you believe this also? Edward shook his head quickly. No. Or at least I didn't. I thought it was ridiculous. But then things started to happen. At that moment, the door opened, and Mrs. Green appeared with the tea tray. She was a woman of indeterminate age, somewhere between 50 and 60, with a pinched mouth and a figure made sturdy by years of hard work. Her eyes, however, were sharp and darting. She set the tray carefully on the low table. Miss Marple, who never missed a nuance of domestic behaviour, noticed that the cups rattled more than they ought to have. Thank you, Mrs. Green, Edward said. That will be all for now. Yes, sir. The woman hesitated, her gaze flickering from Poirot to Miss Marple and back again. Will you be staying long? She asked, addressing Edward but clearly meaning, are they here because of what we all fear? As long as necessary, Edward said. You needn't worry. She gave him a quick, almost frightened look. Oh, I'm not worried, sir, she said unconvincingly. I'm used to this house. And with that questionable reassurance, she withdrew, closing the door softly behind her. Miss Marple began to pour the tea with quiet efficiency. Milk, Monsieur Poirot? She asked. A little, thank you, Poirot replied, still watching Edward. And now, if you please, these things that began to happen? Edward accepted his cup and saucer, but his hand trembled slightly as he spoke. First it was small things, doors left open that I knew I had closed, books moved from one shelf to another. I thought it was just my imagination, or perhaps Alice being careless. Then, one night, a fire broke out in the library grate. No one had lit it. The embers had been dead for hours. Accidents do occur, Poirot remarked. Yes, that's what I told myself, until the day we heard the scream. He swallowed, staring into his tea as though it might steady him. It was Clara, he said, my cousin. She had been staying here a week. That afternoon she decided to go for a walk by the river at the edge of the grounds. When she came back, she went up to her room to change. A few minutes later, Mrs. Green and I heard her scream. He paused, and Miss Marple's gentle voice prompted him. What had happened? Edward's fingers tightened around the cup. We found her standing in the middle of the room, white as a sheet. On her dressing table, someone had laid out a single object. The silver spoon. The fire crackled softly in the silence that followed. "But the spoon was in the safe," Edward went on. "I had checked it that morning. The safe was still locked. The only keys are mine and the one locked in Uncle Henry's old desk. No one else could have taken it. And yet, there it was, on Clara's table." Miss Marple's eyes were very bright. "And how did your cousin react?" she asked. "She said it meant she was next," Edward replied hoarsely. "Next to die." "Die?" Poirot repeated sharply. "Why should she say such a thing?" "Because," Edward said, "in my uncle's notes he kept, pages and pages of them, there is a pattern. Before every death in the family, someone claimed to have seen the silver spoon appear unexpectedly, on a pillow, on a plate, in a cradle, as though it were choosing its victim." Poirot sat back, his expression suddenly very still. "And has there been," he asked quietly, "any death since you inherited this house?" Edward hesitated. "No," he said at last, "but there has been one accident, and if I am not mistaken, Monsieur Poirot, the silver spoon has appeared again." Miss Marple set down the teapot with great care. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the window-panes, as though the house itself were listening. Poirot's voice was soft, but it carried a new weight. "Then, Monsieur Langdon, it seems you were quite right to send for us. For where there is a pattern of misfortune, there is often no curse at all, only a very determined human hand. And," Miss Marple added gently, folding her small hands in her lap, "I have never yet known an object to move about a house of its own accord. Someone always carries it. The real question is, why?" Edward looked from one to the other of them, as though seeing, for the first time, not two mild visitors, but the keen intelligence behind their unassuming appearances. "I'll show you the spoon," he said finally, "and my uncle's notes. After that, you may tell me whether you think I'm a fool." Poirot smiled faintly. "Do not be troubled, monsieur. It is not the fools who interest Hercule Poirot. It is the clever ones." "Yes," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, her eyes on the fire, "and I'm afraid clever people do the most dreadful things when they believe they have something to lose." Outside, the winter light was already beginning to fade. Inside Willowbank Hall, with the silver spoon waiting in its secret place, the stage was quietly being set. Chapter 2. The Disappearance at Midnight. The hours before midnight at Willowbank Hall passed with a curious heaviness, as though the house were listening to its own heartbeat. After tea, Miss Marple and Poirot retired to their respective rooms to unpack and refresh themselves before dinner. The corridors were dimly lit by wall sconces that flickered with a steady, almost restrained glow, and the air carried a faint, persistent chill, as though the very bones of the house remembered something unpleasant. Poirot's room was spacious, though sparsely furnished. The bed was large, the wardrobe old, with brass handles polished by generations of hands. A small writing desk stood near the window, overlooking the dark sweep of the gardens. As he unpacked his valise, Poirot placed his brushes and bottles with the same precision a surgeon might employ when arranging instruments for an operation. "Order," he murmured to himself. "Where there is order, there can be no confusion. And where there is no confusion, Poirot can see clearly." Yet something in the room bothered him. He turned, slowly, scanning the furniture, the floor, the window. At last his eyes settled on the fireplace. The ashes were cold but disturbed. Someone had poked through them recently. He bent, examining the grey dust with fastidious distaste. "The house is full of small mysteries," he said softly. "I wonder how many are connected." Meanwhile, in her own room down the hall, Miss Marple had finished arranging her modest belongings. Her room was smaller and cosier than Poirot's, with faded floral curtains and a little chair by the bed. She had noted at once that the coverlet had been mended with a different thread, that the buttons on the wardrobe were mismatched, and that a single long white thread clung to the carpet near the threshold caught, no doubt, from someone's hem. She tucked her umbrella neatly by the door and sat down to examine a small knitted square she'd brought along. It was not a piece of handiwork in progress. Rather, it was something she used to keep her fingers nimble while she thought. And she had a great many thoughts. Poor Clara Langdon's scream echoed in her mind, the silver spoon appearing in her room, a family heirloom with a supposed history of doom. And Edward Langdon, who seemed genuinely afraid, though he tried not to show it. Miss Marple had seen fear many times disguised as bravado, as irritation, as determination. Young Edward Langdon carried his fear in his shoulders, tense and uncertain. A knock at her door interrupted her reflections. "Come in," she called. It was Alice, the maid, a slight young woman with pale skin and nervous eyes that darted about the room like frightened birds. "Mrs. Green sent me, miss," she said. "Dinner will be served in half an hour." "Thank you, my dear," Miss Marple said kindly. "Such a large house must keep everyone quite busy." Alice hesitated. "It does, miss, but it's been harder lately, since things started happening." Miss Marple's expression softened. "You mean the silver spoon?" The girl flinched. I don't like talking about it, miss. It's wicked, that spoon. It shouldn't be here." "Nonsense, child," Miss Marple said gently. "A spoon cannot be wicked. Only people can." But Alice was shaking her head, backing toward the door. "You don't know, miss. You don't know what it's done." Miss Marple wanted to ask more, but Alice fled before another word could be spoken. Dinner that evening was strained. The dining room was imposing, with long windows draped in heavy fabric and portraits of stern-faced Langdons glaring down from the walls. The table was set beautifully, but the atmosphere was as brittle as thin ice. Edward Langdon sat at the head, trying valiantly to hold the conversation together. Clara Langdon sat opposite him, her face pale and drawn, her eyes shadowed. Poirot and Miss Marple were seated on either side of her. Mrs. Green supervised the serving of the meal with a rigid posture and pursed lips, as though holding back 1,000 unspoken anxieties. At one point, Poirot leaned toward Clara and asked quietly, "Mademoiselle, how do you fare this evening?" She gave a small, hollow laugh. "I suppose I am faring as well as one can when haunted by a spoon." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "It is not the spoon that haunts. It is someone behind it." Clara's hands trembled as she lifted her glass. "That is what frightens me even more." Miss Marple observed her closely. She was not merely frightened, she was expectant, like someone who believed catastrophe was coming. The clock struck 9. The meal ended with little ceremony. Edward excused himself to check on something in the library. Clara claimed a headache and returned to her room. Mrs. Green retired to the kitchen, dragging the reluctant Alice with her. Poirot and Miss Marple remained behind. "This house," Poirot said softly, "has the atmosphere of a powder keg." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, "and I fear someone is holding a match." Just then, a sudden gust of air rattled the windows. Poirot frowned. "A storm is coming, mademoiselle." Miss Marple folded her napkin. "I am not entirely sure it will be from outside." They separated for the night at 10:30, agreeing to reconvene in the morning. By 11, Willowbank was silent. The corridors were dark, save for a few dim bulbs left burning. Wind whispered beneath the doors. Somewhere a floorboard creaked. Midnight approached, and with it, something else. The library at Willowbank Hall was a long room lined with bookcases, stretching from floor to ceiling. A single lamp glowed on the desk, casting soft, golden light across the polished wood. Edward Langdon sat alone, sorting through his uncle's old papers, yellowed pages filled with scrawled handwriting, newspaper clippings, wills, and family letters. He hadn't told Poirot or Miss Marple everything. Not yet. There was one note in particular he could not bring himself to show them, his uncle's last entry, written the night he died. "It comes tonight. I hear it in the corridor. If it reaches the spoon, the curse will be complete." Edward shivered. At 5 minutes to midnight, he locked the papers inside the desk drawer. His thoughts felt tangled, muddled. Perhaps he was overtired. Perhaps the house was getting to him. He stood, stretching his aching shoulders, and reached for the library door. It was then he heard it. A faint scraping sound, metallic, slow, as though something small and hard were being dragged along the floor. His pulse quickened. He opened the door a crack and peered into the hall. Nothing. Only shadows. He closed the door again. Yet the sound continued. Meanwhile, Poirot lay fully awake in his bed. He seldom slept immediately, preferring to examine the events of the day in the calm solitude of night. His mind clicked through observations like gears of a watch. Clara's terror, Alice's evasiveness, Mrs. Green's peculiar tension, Edward's silence on certain matters, and above all, the silver spoon locked in a safe that seemingly did not prevent its mysterious appearances. And always, Poirot murmured, a pattern, a chain of events, each link made by human hands. He sat up, adjusting his moustaches. With habitual precision, something felt wrong. There was a sound in the corridor, not loud, just enough to disturb the air. Poirot slipped on his dressing gown and stepped into the hall. A dim light glowed faintly at the far end. Was it the library or Clara's room? He moved toward it, listening. The hall was silent, but the air carried an unmistakable sense of disturbance, like a room entered moments before. Miss Marple was also awake. She had risen to fetch her shawl when she heard a door open somewhere nearby, heavy footsteps, then lighter ones, perhaps two different people. She wrapped the shawl around her shoulders and opened her door silently, peering into the passage. A light glimmered from the direction of Clara's room. Miss Marple's heart tightened. She moved quickly, quietly, her steps muffled by the carpet runner. At that exact moment, Edward Langdon flung open the library door and stepped into the corridor, only to collide directly with Poirot. "Ah!" Poirot exclaimed softly. "You are out late, monsieur." Edward paled. I thought I heard something." Poirot's eyes flicked to the library behind him. "And you worked there until midnight? This is impressive dedication." Before Edward could reply, a scream tore through the hall. A woman's scream, sharp, shrill, and filled with terror. Poirot and Edward froze. The scream came again. "Clara!" Edward gasped. They ran. Miss Marple was already there, standing at the threshold of Clara's open door, her face pale but composed. Poirot reached her side in seconds. Inside the bedroom, Clara Langdon stood shaking uncontrollably, one hand pressed to her mouth. Her eyes were wide, staring at her dressing table. Miss Marple spoke softly. "Steady, my dear. We are here." Poirot followed Clara's gaze. On the dressing table lay a single object, small, silver, gleaming faintly in the moonlight. The silver spoon. But this time it was not simply placed there. It was stained, dark, wet. Poirot stepped forward. "Do not touch it," he said sharply. Edward pushed past him. "Clara, what?" Clara sobbed, pointing at the spoon. It wasn't here. I swear it wasn't here. I came in only moments ago and... Her voice failed. Miss Marple approached the table slowly. She leaned forward. Her eyes narrowed. "Not blood," she said quietly. "Ink." "Ink?" Edward whispered. Poirot nodded. "Yes, fresh ink. Someone is sending a message, monsieur." "Who would do such a thing?" Clara cried. Poirot turned toward the doorway. Someone was standing in the corridor. Mrs. Green, her face white as linen, her hands clenched around something. Poirot stepped closer. "Madame," he said softly, "where have you been tonight?" She swallowed. I heard the scream. I came at once." Poirot's eyes darted downward. In her right hand, Mrs. Green held a handkerchief. Black ink stained the edge. He held out his hand. "May I see that, madame?" Her fingers trembled. She opened her mouth, but before she could answer, another sound echoed through the hall, a heavy, distant crash. From downstairs, Miss Marple whispered, "The library." Poirot's eyes sharpened. "Come," he said, "quickly." They hurried down the corridor. At the bottom of Creedays, the stairs, a terrible sight awaited them. The library door had been forced open, the safe stood ajar, and the silver spoon, the real spoon, not the ink-stained decoy, was gone, stolen, and with it, the truth behind everything just became far more dangerous. Chapter 3. Suspects in the drawing room. The storm broke fully by dawn. Rain slashed against the tall windows of Willowbank Hall in furious sheets, and the wind moaned between the chimneys like a restless spirit. Inside the house, despite the fire already crackling in the drawing room, a peculiar coldness clung to the air, as though the events of midnight had seeped into the walls. Poirot, immaculate as ever, stood before the fire with his hands clasped behind his back. Miss Marple sat quietly in a patterned armchair nearby, her eyes fixed on the rain but her mind clearly elsewhere. Edward Langdon paced the length of the room, pale and harried. Clara sat at the far end of the sofa, knees drawn close, her fingers twisting a handkerchief she had no awareness of holding. Mrs. Green and Alice stood near the doorway, both looking as though they'd rather be anywhere else. Poirot broke the silence. Since the silver spoon, the real silver spoon, has vanished from the safe, we must consider that someone in this house engineered its disappearance. His moustaches twitched as he surveyed the room. We shall not leave this matter to speculation. Let us discuss what occurred last night. Edward stopped pacing. I don't understand how the safe was opened. The key was on my person all evening. Are you absolutely certain, monsieur? Poirot asked. Yes, Edward insisted. It never left my pocket. Alice, the maid, shivered. But the door was broken, sir. Someone must have forced it. Miss Marple spoke gently. Locks can be forced, my dear, but not without noise. And last night the house was very quiet. Alice looked down, wringing her hands. Poirot stroked his chin. There are two explanations. Either the door was forced earlier before the storm, before the scream, or someone in this household possesses a talent for silence. He turned to Mrs. Green. Madame, you were near the corridor at the time of the scream. Tell us, did you hear anything before that? Mrs. Green stiffened. No, sir, not a sound. And I don't appreciate the implication. There is no implication, Poirot said smoothly. Only a desire for facts. Miss Marple's voice, soft but sharp as a knitting needle, drifted through the room. Sometimes it is the very absence of a sound that is important. Edward stared at her. What do you mean? Well, Miss Marple said, folding her hands, consider the library. If someone had broken into the safe shortly before the alarm was raised, they would have had to approach the room, force the door, open the safe, none of which are silent activities. Yet no one heard a thing. Clara swallowed. Then perhaps it happened before. Dinner? Mrs. Green shot her a quick glance. Impossible. I was in and out of the library all afternoon. Doing what? Poirot asked. Mrs. Green's chin lifted. Overseeing the housekeeping and looking for the missing ledger. Poirot raised an eyebrow. Ledger? Yes, she said shortly. An accounts ledger that went missing 2 days ago. Edward's eyes widened. Why didn't you tell me? I didn't think it important, Mrs. Green lied quickly. Miss Marple noticed the lie. She always noticed lies, but she said nothing for the moment. Poirot moved to the center of the room. We need clarity, so let us consider motives. Edward bristled. Motives? Why would anyone want a cursed spoon? Poirot turned to him calmly. There are two types of people who seek an object with a dark history, those who fear it and those who can use it. A quiet tremor passed through the room. Poirot nodded. Exactly. He began pacing slowly. Someone in this house has a reason to control the narrative of the spoon, to make it appear cursed, to frighten those around them, to stage events, to manipulate emotion. Miss Marple added, and, when objects are moved without explanation, there is always someone who benefits from the fear created. She looked meaningfully at each face in turn. Edward frightened yet holding something back. Clara terrified, yes, but also overwhelmed by guilt or expectation. Mrs. Green hard. secretive, and guarding the house as though it belonged to her. Alice, the trembling maid who knew far more than she dared to say. Poirot clasped his hands. "Let us take each of you in turn." Mrs. Green bristled. "Is that necessary?" "Absolutely," Poirot replied. He gestured to Edward first. "Monsieur Langdon, you inherit everything, the house, the grounds, the valuables. Yet you claim to know nothing of your uncle's obsession. Why is that, I wonder?" Edward flushed. "Because I wasn't close to him. I told you that." "Ah, but you have not told us why," Poirot said softly. Edward looked away. Poirot did not push yet. Instead, he turned. "Mademoiselle Clara." Clara startled. "Yes?" "You were the last person to see the silver spoon before last night's disappearance when it appeared mysteriously in your room." He studied her trembling hands. "And you have been more frightened of it than anyone." Clara looked at the floor. "Because terrible things happen when it appears. Or because someone wishes you to believe they will," Poirot countered. A tear slipped down her cheek. Poirot moved on. "Mrs. Green." Mrs. Green's eyes hardened. "I've served this house for decades. I've done nothing wrong. But you—" "Resent change," Miss Marple said gently. "Many housekeepers do. A new master means new ways." Mrs. Green's lips pressed together. "And," Miss Marple continued, "you seem determined to protect certain histories, including the disappearance of a ledger?" Mrs. Green turned fierce. "That ledger concerns the family's finances, nothing more." Poirot exchanged a glance with Miss Marple. They did not believe her. Finally, Poirot addressed Alice. The maid jumped. "Tell me, mademoiselle, did you enter the library yesterday?" Alice shook her head violently. "No, no, sir." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Are you quite sure? I noticed ink on your hands last night." Alice froze like a rabbit cornered. I spilt some earlier. In the kitchen," she stammered. Mrs. Green snapped. "Alice, that will do." Poirot's voice turned silky. "You see how it is, Miss Marple? Each has secrets. Each has fear. And fear, mademoiselle, is the perfect soil for manipulation." Miss Marple nodded. "So now we must determine not only who benefits from the spoon's disappearance, but who controls its story." Edward exhaled shakily. "I feel as though I don't know my own house anymore." Poirot gave a small, sympathetic nod. "Perhaps that is because there is something your house has not yet revealed." Lightning flashed against the window. The fire popped loudly. Then, from somewhere deep inside the mansion, a faint knocking sound echoed. Steady, slow, metallic. Clara shrieked. Alice covered her ears. Even Mrs. Green paled. Poirot turned sharply to Miss Marple. "Mademoiselle, you heard that?" "I did," she said. "And you know what it means?" She folded her hands. "Yes, someone is moving through the house, someone who wants us to hear them." Poirot stepped toward the door. "Then we must follow the sound." And with that, the drawing-room became a chamber of suspects, and the house a labyrinth of secrets waiting to unfold. The knocking sound echoed again, 3 sharp metallic taps, precisely spaced. Not the rhythm of a random noise or the settling of old pipes. No, this was deliberate, calculated, designed to be heard. Poirot moved swiftly toward the hallway. "Come," he said. "The house is speaking. We shall listen." Miss Marple rose carefully and followed him, her umbrella in one hand, her eyes sharp behind her soft expression. Edward, Clara, Mrs. Green, and Alice trailed behind, though the 2 women looked as though they would rather stay in the one room where light offered safety. The corridor outside was dim, the single bulb flickering. The knocking came again, this time faintly from the upper floor. Poirot glanced at Miss Marple. "Upstairs," she nodded. "The servants' storage rooms, perhaps." "And the old nursery," Edward added quietly. "It's been shut for years." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Ah, a shut room is always an invitation for mischief. Let us see." They climbed the staircase. The air grew colder with each step, as though the house were exhaling frost. At the top landing, a long corridor stretched before them, lined with closed doors, each one numbered in Edward's great-grandfather's peculiar system of order. Again, tap, tap, tap. Alice let out a small cry. Mrs. Green grabbed her arm with a sharp whisper. "Compose yourself." Poirot held up a hand. "Silence, s'il vous plaît." They approached the far end of the corridor. Miss Marple's eyes scanned the floor. Tiny specks of something dust, disturbed recently, marked a faint trail leading toward the nursery. "The door," she murmured. Indeed, the old nursery door was ajar, a fraction just enough for a thin line of darkness to show. Poirot gently pushed it open. The room was cold and unfriendly, its shutters drawn, the wallpaper faded with age. A rocking horse stood in the corner, one wooden ear missing. A small iron cot lay against the wall, and in the center of the floor. Miss Marple gasped softly. There, lying neatly on the dusty boards, was another silver object. Edward froze. "Is that?" Poirot stooped carefully, not touching it, merely studying. It was a teaspoon, but not the silver spoon. This one was tarnished, dull, ordinary. Clara whispered, "What does it mean?" Poirot paced slowly around it. "It means someone wishes to frighten you. Someone wishes to draw us here. But why?" Miss Marple examined the floor. She pointed with her umbrella tip at a faint smear of fresh mud leading toward the window. "Someone came in here recently. Their shoes were wet." Poirot nodded. "From outside?" "No, the window is locked." "So they came along the corridor." "Someone who had access," Miss Marple murmured. Poirot turned to Edward. "Who knows about this room?" "Everyone here," Edward admitted. "It's no secret, but no one has used it for years." Miss Marple's eyes drifted toward the cot. She moved closer. A small bit of fabric was caught on the iron frame, dark cotton, torn. "Not from the bedding," she said softly. "From someone's clothing." Alice whimpered. "Please, please, can we leave? I don't like this room." "I know the wand." Poirot fixed her with a steady gaze. "Then perhaps you should tell us what you know, mademoiselle." Alice burst into tears. "I don't know anything, I swear. I only... She looked at Mrs. Green, who shook her head violently. Poirot saw it. Miss Marple saw it. Edward saw it too. "Mrs. Green," Edward said sharply, "you're stopping her from speaking." Mrs. Green drew herself up. "I am doing nothing of the sort. She is hysterical." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said gently, "because she has been carrying more than she can bear." Alice sobbed. "I didn't take the spoon. I just put it where I was told." The air went still. Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Ah, très intéressant." Mrs. Green snapped. "Alice, be quiet." Miss Marple stepped between them, soft but firm. "Child, who told you to move the spoon?" Alice shook her head wildly. I can't say. She said it would be worse if I did." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "She?" Alice clapped a hand over her mouth. Mrs. Green grabbed her arm. "Alice, not another word." "Enough," Edward said sharply. "Mrs. Green, you will step away from her." For the first time, Mrs. Green obeyed, but bitterness twisted her mouth. Poirot spoke gently. "We will not force you, Alice. Not yet. But know this, you are safe now. The truth will protect you better than silence." Alice shivered but said nothing more. Poirot walked the room again, considering. Someone placed this ordinary spoon here to mimic the silver. Spoon another illusion, another attempt to create fear. Miss Marple nodded. "Fear is being used to herd us around the house like sheep." Poirot looked at Edward. "Your family history contains secrets, old grievances, something someone wishes to conceal or expose." Edward nodded faintly. "Yes, and perhaps my uncle's obsession with the silver spoon threatened that secret." Miss Marple added softly, "And now that secret threatens his heir." Clara gasped. "You think someone wants Edward harmed?" Poirot raised a hand. "It is a possibility." Then he crouched again by the ordinary spoon, staring at it with narrowed eyes. "Someone is using spoons as messages," he murmured. "Not objects of a curse, but symbols of intent." Miss Marple's voice came quiet and steady. Then we must determine what message this one carries. Lightning split the sky. Thunder rolled across the hills. Poirot rose. We go back downstairs. Each of you will answer more questions. No more secrets. Miss Marple offered her arm to Clara, who leaned on her, trembling. As they filed out of the nursery, Poirot paused at the door and looked back one last time. The rocking horse rocked, just once, slowly, silently, and no breeze had touched it. Poirot's face hardened. "This," he whispered, "is no ghost story. It is the work of a very clever mind." He shut the door. Behind it, Willowbank Hall held its breath. Chapter 4. Clues, Hidden in Silver. By late afternoon, the storm had dulled to a miserable drizzle. The sky over Willowbank was the colour of old pewter, and the grounds lay under a damp, uneasy hush. Inside, the house seemed to gather its shadows more closely to itself, as if reluctant to reveal anything further. Poirot and Miss Marple were once more in the port library, now very much the centre of the mystery. The broken safe stood in the corner, its door hanging slightly askew. Tools lay on a sheet of newspaper Mrs. Green had put down, though none of them, Poirot suspected, were the real instruments used to open it. Edward Langdon hovered nearby, uncertain and tired, his face drawn. Clara had been persuaded to rest after a mild sedative from the village doctor, Mrs. Green and Alice were somewhere in the depths of the house, their movements oddly synchronized, like two people bound by the same fearful secret. Poirot stood at the desk, where Henry Langdon's papers had been spread out. "It is a curious thing, Miss Marple," he said, "that a man who believes in a curse keeps such careful notes. A curse is usually the refuge of those who have no explanation. But here," he held up a sheaf of yellowed pages, "we have explanations in abundance, patterns, dates, names." Miss Marple, seated near the window with her knitting resting serenely in her lap, nodded. "People do like patterns, I've noticed. They prefer to believe misfortune is part of a grand design rather than the result of ordinary human wickedness or foolishness. It's more dignified." Poirot smiled faintly. "Yes, you are very right. How much more comfortable to say, 'It was the curse,' than to admit, 'It was my brother, or my cousin, or myself.'" Edward shifted. "You think my uncle was wrong, that he imagined it all?" Poirot's gaze softened. "Non, monsieur, not entirely. Your uncle did what many intelligent men do when isolated too long with their thoughts. He noticed something, one or two small coincidences perhaps, and then he built a story around them," Miss Marple finished gently. "I've seen it happen in Street Mary Mead. A woman loses a brooch the same week her cat falls ill, and from there she decides that anything mislaid is connected with the poor animal. It gives distress a sort of romance." Edward grimaced. "My uncle's romance has turned into a nightmare." Poirot held out one of the pages. "Look here, Miss Marple. The silver spoon is mentioned first in connection with your great-aunt Helena, yes?" he said to Edward. "The woman from the portrait in the hall." "Yes," Edward said. "Grandmother used to say Helena brought the curse in with her, but I always thought that was just family spite. Helena was independent, too independent, perhaps." Miss Marple's eyes brightened. "Independent women in families often attract a great deal of unpleasant legend, especially if they do not marry where they are expected." Poirot pointed to the page. "According to these notes, the spoon was presented to Helena on her 21st birthday. Within 3 months, there was a scandal, a broken engagement, an accident, a quarrel over money." Edward nodded slowly. "She was engaged to a man my great-grandfather chose, but Helena broke it off and chose someone else, someone with no money, I believe. My great-grandfather never forgave her." Miss Marple looked thoughtful. "So the spoon is first tied to rebellion, to going against the family's wishes. I imagine that did not go down very well." Poirot turned to Edward. "And after this, any misfortune was linked to the spoon. See here, births, deaths, lost investments, quarrels, illnesses. The spoon was in the room, on the table, placed as a gift or a warning. He shook his head. It became a convenient scapegoat. Miss Marple rose from her chair. And scapegoats are very useful things, Monsieur Poirot, when someone wishes to hide the true cause of trouble, especially if the trouble is themselves. She crossed the room to the wall where a framed copy of the family crest hung a rampant lion, shield, and beneath, delicately etched, a small spoon. "I wonder," she murmured, "whether the spoon was ever meant to be a symbol of misfortune at all." Edward frowned. What else could it be? "Oh, all sorts of things," Miss Marple replied. "In villages, spoons appear in the oddest ways. I once knew a woman who hid her savings by soldering a silver coin to the underside of a soup ladle. She thought no burglar would bother with the kitchen drawer." Poirot watched her keenly. "You are suggesting the spoon may be altered more than it appears?" "Or perhaps less," Miss Marple said. "Sometimes an object is simply a key, whether to a person's emotions or to something more literal." Poirot turned back to the desk. "There is also this," he said, selecting a folded paper from among the notes. "Your uncle traced the spoon's design. See the little marks, the tiny engravings along the handle?" Edward stepped closer. "I never noticed those." Miss Marple joined them. The drawing was meticulous, with each delicate curve an engraved line reproduced in ink. Along the handle, running from bowl to tip, there was a pattern of tiny symbols, dots, dashes, and curious curls. Poirot tapped the page. "Your uncle thought this pattern merely decorative. He notes that the engraver was unknown, that the work was very fine. But perhaps it is more than decoration." "Like a code?" Edward asked. "Perhaps," Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Or a map? Or both?" Miss Marple smiled. "I once had a knitting pattern like that. It looked quite random to anyone else, but if you knew how to read it, it made perfect sense. Knit 2, purl 1, slip stitch, yarn over. Oh, one could hide all kinds of information in such a thing." "A code in a spoon," Edward said faintly. "It sounds absurd." "Most things do, before someone explains them," Miss Marple replied kindly. Poirot nodded. "Your uncle was obsessed with misfortune. But what if the spoon's true significance is not its supposed curse, but something quite different? Something to do with money, perhaps, or land, a hidden claim?" Edward's face grew thoughtful. "There were rumors, you know, in the village, that the Langdons had some old, unclaimed inheritance, that there was a reason my great-grandfather clung to Willowbank even when money ran short." Miss Marple's eyes shone. "Oh, village rumors are rarely baseless. Embellished, yes, but they usually start from something real." Poirot folded the drawing. "Then we must examine the spoon, to itself, closely. Every mark, every scratch." "But it's gone," Edward said helplessly. "Stolen." Poirot smiled. "Ah, but we have seen it before, have we not?" Miss Marple's expression sharpened. "The portrait," she said. "Exactly," Poirot replied. "Your great-aunt Helena is painted holding it, and if the artist was any good, he will have reproduced the engraving accurately." Edward glanced at the door. "It's in the main hall. We can look now." Poirot straightened his cuffs. "Then, Monsieur Langdon, let us go and consult your ancestor. I have the feeling she has been waiting a very long time to tell someone the truth." They left the library, stepping back into the corridor where the house's silence seemed to press in on them. Somewhere in the distance, the faint clatter of pots in the kitchen suggested that life continued in its anxious, circumscribed way. As they approached the hall, Miss Marple touched Poirot's arm lightly. "Do you notice it, Monsieur Poirot?" Poirot tilted his head. "The house?" "Yes," she said softly. "It feels expectant, as though someone has set things in motion and is now waiting to see how we react." Poirot's moustaches twitched. "Then we must react in a way they do not expect, n'est-ce pas?" And together they stepped beneath the watchful gaze of the portraits, toward Helena Langdon's silent, painted hand and the silver secret it held. The portrait of Helena Langdon hung halfway up the main staircase, dominating the wall with an almost unsettling presence. Her dark eyes seemed to follow them as they climbed, her mouth set in a faint, enigmatic smile. The silver object in her hand gleamed faintly despite the muted light of the overcast day. Edward paused on the step below the portrait, folding his arms as though bracing himself against some old family judgment. "She was never spoken of kindly when I was a boy," he said quietly. "Too headstrong, too outspoken. Helena brought the curse, grandmother used to say when something went wrong." Miss Marple regarded the painted woman with interest. "She looks more like someone who refused to do as she was told," she observed. "Families often prefer to call that a curse." Poirot moved closer, peering at the frame, the brushwork, the details of Helena's hand. "It is not a bad painting," he said. "Not a masterpiece, but competent. The artist had the eye for detail, at least." He focused on the spoon. The painter had depicted it carefully, a delicate, elongated bowl and slender handle, with faint markings along its length. "Edward, my friend," Poirot said, "may we have a ladder? Something to bring us closer?" "Of course," Edward said. "I'll fetch one. There should be one in the old cloakroom." As he disappeared down the stairs, Miss Marple remained, her gaze drifting from Helena's painted face to the other portraits along the wall, men and women from different eras, each carrying their own silent scandals. "You?" "No," she said. "I once knew a family in which an old photograph was blamed for everything that went wrong. It was simply a photograph of a great-grandfather in uniform, but someone had decided it was unlucky. Whenever a plate broke or a child caught a cold, the photograph received the blame." Poirot smiled. "And did anyone ever break it?" "No," Miss Marple said, "because that would have meant losing the excuse. Once you break the unlucky thing, you must face the real causes." "Alors," Poirot murmured, "perhaps someone here would rather not lose their excuse." Edward returned with a small but sturdy stepladder. Poirot climbed it carefully, Miss Marple hovering anxiously below. "Be careful, Monsieur Poirot," she cautioned. "These old steps can be treacherous." "Fear not, mademoiselle," he said lightly. "Poirot has the balance of a dancer." Reaching the appropriate height, he leaned closer to the canvas. The spoon's engravings, though softened by age and varnish, were visible. Tiny shapes along the handle, dots, short lines, small curves. He took out a small notebook and pencil from his pocket and began to copy them, line by line. Miss Marple watched from below. "Well?" she called quietly. "Most interesting," Poirot said. "The pattern seems not random at all, but deliberate. See here 3 short lines, then a dot, then a curve, repeated further down. It is almost like a cipher. Or perhaps a route," Miss Marple suggested, "like one of those maps children draw, with marks for stepping stones." Poirot descended the ladder, notebook in hand. "It may be," he said, "or it may represent something more abstract. We must think about what a wealthy family with land and secrets might have wished to hide." "Money," Miss Marple said promptly. "Or documents, or a scandal." Edward looked from the notebook to the portrait and back again. "There were rumors," he said slowly, "that Helena discovered something my great-grandfather wished kept quiet. Some transaction, land sold underhandedly, a debt. No one ever told me the details." "Miss," Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "And if Helena refused to be silent, perhaps she needed a way to preserve the truth without anyone realizing she had done so." Poirot nodded. "So she might encode it into an object no one would suspect, something always in the family's possession." "The spoon," Edward said. "Exactement." They moved back toward the library, the notebook now more valuable than any jewel in Poirot's estimation. "Of course," Miss Marple remarked, "if the spoon holds a secret that could alter who owns what or who has a claim, then someone might be very keen indeed to get hold of it before we do." Poirot glanced sideways at her. "You are thinking of the inheritance?" "I am thinking," said Miss Marple mildly, "of how people behave when they feel their security is threatened. I have seen apparently respectable men do very questionable things when land or money is at stake." As they entered the library once more, they found Mrs. Green already there, dusting shelves with an air of fierce duty. She started when she saw them. "Did you need something, sir?" she asked Edward, though her eyes flicked uneasily to Poirot's notebook. "Yes," Edward said. "We needed to compare something with my uncle's notes." Mrs. Green's gaze lingered on the broken safe. "You shouldn't stir up old business, if you'll pardon me saying so. Some things are better left alone." Miss Marple gave her a kindly look. "Oh, I don't know. In my experience, things that are left alone too long tend to fester. Much better to clean them out properly." Mrs. Green's mouth thinned. She set down the duster abruptly. "If there's nothing else, I should see to the kitchen." She left quickly. Edward watched her go. "She's been with this house longer than I've been alive," he said. "Sometimes I think she resents every breath I take in it." Miss Marple's tone was thoughtful. "Long service often comes with a sense of ownership. She might well feel the house belongs to her more than to any of you. And if the spoon hides something that changes the house's future," Poirot added, "she would care very deeply what that something is." He opened his notebook and spread out Henry Langdon's tracing of the spoon beside it. "Now," he said briskly, "let us look." Uncle Henry copied the design from the real spoon. The artist copied it for Helena's portrait. "We have 2 sources. We must see whether they match." They bent over the papers together. Miss Marple pointed with one neat, gloved finger. "There, that cluster of marks, here in the tracing and here in the portrait." Poirot nodded. "And again, near the bowl, the same groups. This is not decorative. It is systematic." Edward ran a hand through his hair. "If it is a code, how do we read it?" Poirot's eyes flickered to the shelves. "Tell me, monsieur, do you have old maps of the estate? Plans of the land? The house?" "Yes," Edward said. "In the cabinet over there." "Excellent. Bring them, if you please." While Edward fetched the maps, Miss Marple sat down again, her eyes distant. "Imagine," she said softly, "that Helena discovered something, perhaps a hidden boundary, a stream that belonged to someone else, land taken unlawfully. Perhaps she wished to record its location, but feared the papers would be destroyed. And so," Poirot said, "she used the spoon, the engravings as a representation of the land or of a path, a concealed map in plain sight." Edward spread the maps across the desk. Old ink, curling edges, the estate marked with fields, woods, and a river. Poirot held the notebook above the map, narrowing his eyes. "Look here," he mused. 3 marks at the top, 3 copse of trees near the north boundary, a curve, the bend in the river. Miss Marple leaned in. "It does seem to echo the shape, does it not? Like a miniature of the estate carved into the spoon's handle." "Which would mean," Poirot said slowly, "that one section, one particular point may indicate something hidden there. Money, documents, or a secret someone would kill to keep buried." Edward's breath caught. "And if Uncle Henry worked that out," Miss Marple finished quietly, "then perhaps that is the real reason he died unexpectedly." Silence fell. Then, from outside the door, came a faint sound. A floorboard creaked. Then another. Poirot's voice was very soft. "We are not alone." He closed the notebook with a snap. "Who is there?" he called. There was no answer, only the slow, retreating sound of footsteps in the corridor. Miss Marple's eyes were calm, but there was a new steel in them. "Whoever it is," she said, "has just learned that we are closer to the truth than they expected." Poirot smiled without humour. "Then, Miss Marple, it is time." We stopped letting the silver spoon move us and began, instead, to move the pieces on the board ourselves. Chapter 5. The First Revelation. The fog thickened over Willowbank Hall by evening, rolling across the grounds like a pale, creeping tide. The house stood in the midst of it like a lone ship at sea, isolated, muffled, and strangely watchful. Inside, fires burned in several rooms, but the warmth they offered did little to dispel the tension that had settled over the household. Poirot and Miss Marple had spent the late afternoon studying the engraved code, comparing the partes. symbols to the estate map. Their conclusion was tentative but promising. The silver spoon did indeed appear to represent the land. Somewhere on the property was a location Helena Langdon had marked, something her descendants had not understood for generations. But another matter troubled them even more. Someone inside Willowbank already knew this, and someone was determined to keep them from uncovering it. As dusk fell, Poirot requested everyone's presence in the drawing-room once more. Edward, anxious but resolute, agreed. Clara, fragile but steadier than she had been in days, consented. Quietly, Mrs. Green and Alice arrived reluctantly, the former stiff as iron, the latter pale as paper. In the drawing-room, the lamps glowed softly and cast long shadows across the walls. A log cracked sharply in the fireplace. Poirot stood before them, hands clasped, expression severe. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "we are gathered because the situation has become, how shall I say, delicate. The silver spoon, an object of some mystery, has been weaponized, used to frighten, used to deceive, used to manipulate." Mrs. Green huffed. "You say weaponized as though it's a gun. It's only a spoon." Poirot's eyebrows lifted. "A gun, madame, kills the body. A symbol can poison the mind. And fear, madame, fear kills far more surely." Mrs. Green looked discomfited. "At Willowbank," Poirot continued, "fear has been cultivated with great care. The appearances of the spoon, the scream in the night, the theft from the safe, and most recently, the placement of an ordinary spoon in the old nursery to lure us." Clara shuddered. "Why? Why trick us like that?" "To direct our attention," Miss Marple replied gently, "or to test whether we were getting close." Alice, trembling, wrung her apron. "I didn't mean to frighten anyone. I only did what I was told." Edward frowned. "Yes, Alice, and now you must tell us plainly. Who told you?" Alice's gaze darted wildly around the room. Mrs. Green's eyes narrowed, silently commanding her to stay quiet. Poirot stepped forward. "Mademoiselle, you are safe. No one will harm you, but your silence may protect the wrong person." Miss Marple added softly, "Secrets can be heavier than burdens, my dear. Sometimes speaking them lightens the load." Alice swallowed hard. A tear slid down her cheek. It was Mrs. Green," she whispered at last. Mrs. Green startled as though slapped. "You little fool!" Alice flinched but pressed on. "She said I had to. She said the spoon had to appear in Clara's room, or the curse would fall on the house again. She said it was for the family's safety." All eyes turned to Mrs. Green. Poirot's voice was icy. "Madame, you orchestrated the appearance of the spoon?" Mrs. Green's face hardened, but her voice wavered. "Not the real one. Only the appearances are my doing. I never touched the real spoon. Never." Miss Marple folded her hands. "Why?" "Frighten poor Clara in such a dreadful way." "She needed to know," Mrs. Green cried. "Needed to understand what she was interfering with. Everything went wrong the last time a Langdon girl meddled in old business." She pointed furiously at Helena's portrait, visible through the open doorway. "Helena ruined this family. She tore it apart. And now Clara's voice rose, trembling. "I haven't done anything." "You asked questions," Mrs. Green snapped. "You poked about where you shouldn't. You've always been too curious for your own good. Just like her." Poirot interjected sharply. "This does not explain the ink-stained spoon, madame." Mrs. Green's eyes dropped. "I meant to frighten Miss Clara, not harm her. If she understood the spoon's power, she'd keep her distance. If she kept her distance, the house would be safe." Edward stared. "Safe? From what?" "Missus." Green's voice dropped to a harsh whisper. "From the truth." A beat of silence settled like dust. Poirot's eyes gleamed. "What truth, madame?" Mrs. Green pressed her lips together. "The truth that will destroy this house. The truth that Helena tried to expose. The truth that your Uncle Henry discovered. The truth someone is willing to kill for." A faint gasp escaped Clara. Poirot stepped closer. "Mrs. Green, if you know the truth, you must tell us now." She shook her head violently. "I can't. I swore to your uncle, swore I'd never speak of it. And I won't." Miss Marple regarded her with sad comprehension. "You are trying to protect the Langdons, but in doing so, you are shielding a criminal." Mrs. Green looked away. Poirot turned to Edward. "You see, monsieur, the fear in this house has been cultivated not only by the guilty, but also by the loyal." Edward sank into a chair, his face pale. "My God, what is happening in my home?" Miss Marple moved to him with her calm, reassuring manner. "Whatever began in your great-grandfather's time is not finished. Someone is using the legend of the spoon to hide their motive. And someone else," she glanced at Mrs. Green, "has been helping them through fear." Poirot nodded. "Indeed. But now we come to the turning point." He walked to the map on the table and tapped a penciled mark. "This symbol, here on the spoon and here on the map, it points to a place on the property, a location Helena deemed important. A location your Uncle Henry investigated quietly." Edward leaned forward. "Where?" Poirot placed his finger on a point near the river bank. "Here, an outbuilding, nearly forgotten." Miss Marple added, "A place no one visits now. A place where someone might hide documents or remove them." Edward stared at the map. "The old boathouse." Poirot closed the notebook. "Exactement." A tense hush fell. Then Poirot announced, "Tonight we go there." Clara paled. "In the dark? With everything happening?" "Yes," Poirot said firmly, "because someone in this house believes the answers are hidden there, and they may strike again to keep us from finding them." Miss Marple rose with calm determination. "And we must discover the truth before they do." Edward swallowed hard. "I'll get the lanterns." Poirot nodded. "Good. Be swift." Mrs. Green clutched her apron, trembling. Poirot looked at her sharply. "Madam, you will remain here with Alice. Neither of you will leave this room until we return." Mrs. Green's chin lifted. "You don't trust me." Poirot gave a thin smile. "Madame, at this moment, I trust no one." He turned to Miss Marple. "Shall we?" Miss Marple tightened her shawl. "Indeed, Monsieur Poirot, I believe the shadows at Willowbank are about to thin one way or another." And together, the two detectives stepped out into the hall where the house seemed to wait, listening. The first revelation was coming, and Willowbank Hall knew it. The fog thickened by the minute as Poirot, Miss Marple, and Edward crossed the back terrace of Willowbank Hall. The cold night air clung to their clothes, and tendrils of mist curled around their feet like pale fingers reluctant to release them. Edward carried 2 lanterns, one for Poirot, one for Miss Marple. Their glow cast wavering patches of gold onto the path as they moved toward the rear gardens. "We must be cautious," Poirot murmured. "Someone may be watching." "Someone certainly is," Miss Marple said quietly, adjusting her shawl. "Houses like Willowbank always have watchers, some with eyes, some with ears, some with motives." Edward shivered. "I keep thinking we're being followed." Poirot nodded. "Because we are, but do not look back. It is better they think we are unaware." Miss Marple gave a small smile. "Always give people enough rope, and they often use it most helpfully." The path sloped downward toward the river. The old boathouse, seldom used since Edward's childhood, stood near the water's edge. Its timbers sagged slightly with age, and its small dock lay sunken under years of silt and neglect. Miss Marple inhaled. "Such a peaceful place once, I imagine. Before secrets settled here." "Peaceful places are often chosen for secrets," Poirot observed. Edward held his lantern higher. "The door's just ahead." When they reached the structure, the door stood half open. Poirot's moustaches twitched sharply. "That should be impossible." Edward froze. "I locked it myself 3 years ago. No one's been inside since." Poirot tested the handle. It moved freely. "Monsieur," he said softly, "you will remain behind us." Edward hesitated, then obeyed, stepping back. Poirot pushed the door open. The lantern beams pierced the darkness inside, revealing dust-covered crates, oars stacked against a wall, an overturned bench, and the faint smell of river damp. "Careful," Miss Marple murmured. "Old buildings can be treacherous." Poirot moved to the center of the room. Look for footprints, disturbances, anything. Miss Marple wandered toward a shelf where old fishing nets hung like ghostly curtains. She lifted one gently. Dust motes swirled in the lantern light. Then she noticed something. Here, she said softly. Poirot approached. On the wooden floor, a patch of dust had been wiped away. Recently, deliberately. Poirot knelt. Someone knelt here, perhaps lifted a board. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, and here, see, the edge is slightly warped from disturbance. Edward moved closer, squinting. What do you think is there? Poirot took out a small knife from his coat, a slim, elegant blade, and slid it under the loose floorboard. It lifted with a soft creak. Inside lay a small metal box, dark with age. Edward gasped. My uncle was right. Poirot did not touch the box. We should be cautious. It could contain fragile documents. Miss Marple leaned closer. Or evidence someone wished buried. Poirot slowly lifted the box. But something else caught Miss Marple's eye, a fresh footprint behind them, near the doorway. Poirot, she whispered urgently, we have company. At that exact moment, the boathouse door slammed shut. Edward shouted, What, who? Poirot spun toward the noise. A figure's shadow moved past the shuttered window, quick, deliberate, and unmistakably watching them. Miss Marple tightened her grip on her lantern. Whoever it was knows we've found the box. Poirot's voice was calm but sharp. We must leave. Now. He tucked the box under his arm. Edward tried the handle. It won't open. Poirot stepped forward, examining. Locked from the outside. Our watcher wishes to delay us. Miss Marple looked around the small building. There must be another way, perhaps a panel or side exit. Edward shook his head. No, only the front door. Poirot raised his lantern, scanning the beams. We cannot force it, it is old, but sturdy, and we risk alerting them further. Miss Marple stepped toward a small, high window. This may open. It's narrow, but workable. Poirot approached. If we can unlatch it, yes. Together, Poirot and Edward lifted the bottom frame. It stuck, groaned, then gave way with a snap. Cold air rushed in. Poirot glanced at Miss Marple. Mademoiselle, you first. Oh, nonsense. I'm far too old to climb through windows, she replied matter-of-factly. You two go ahead, and then pull me through. Edward climbed out first, dropping lightly onto the damp ground. Poirot followed, twisting gracefully despite his age. They reached back through the window and helped Miss Marple through with surprising ease. Thank you, she said warmly. One never knows when a bit of gardening experience will come in handy. Once outside, Poirot scanned the fog. Our watcher has fled, but not far. Edward pointed toward the trees. There, a lantern moving away. Poirot nodded grimly. We must return to the house at once, before they do. Miss Marple touched the metal box. Yes, this contains answers someone desperately wants, hidden or destroyed, Poirot added. As they hurried back toward Willowbank, the lantern glow ahead vanished into the haze. But the house awaited them, lit, silent, and brimming with expectation. By the time they reached the terrace, Edward noticed something alarming. The drawing room. Lights there off, he whispered. Poirot stiffened. Mrs. Green and Alice were there. Miss Marple's voice dropped. And now someone else is. Poirot handed her the box. Mademoiselle, he said firmly, keep this safe. Whatever happens next, this must not leave your hands. She nodded. Together, they stepped into the shadowed hallway. A faint sound drifted from the drawing room. A cry, high-pitched, terrified. Then, silence. Poirot's voice hardened. The first revelation, he murmured, is about to show its face. He pushed open the drawing-room door. Chapter 6. Trapped in the hidden passage. The drawing-room lay shrouded in shadows when Poirot flung open the door, the lantern light slicing through the gloom. The curtains billowed slightly, as though something or someone had disturbed the air only moments before. Mrs. Green? Edward called shakily. Alice? There was no answer. Poirot stepped inside, his eyes narrowing. Furniture stood untouched. the hearth embers glowing faintly, but something felt wrong, an absence, a void where the living should have been. Miss Marple, lantern held steadily, drifted to the center of the room. There, not here, she murmured, but someone was, not long ago. Poirot's gaze swept deliberately over the room, there on the carpet. A small object glimmered faintly in the lamplight. Miss Marple bent to examine it with careful fingers. A button, she said softly, torn off, coarse thread, likely, from a maid's uniform. Edward blanched. Alice. Meaning Alice had been here and taken. But why her? Poirot examined the torn threads. This was not from a fall. It was torn in a struggle. Miss Marple stood. The question is, did she struggle with someone inside the room, or was she dragged out by force? Poirot answered with a grim certainty. Dragged out. Someone needed silence and speed. The house groaned, then a long, low creak, like old bones complaining. Edward stiffened. That sound. It came from the hall. Poirot nodded. We are being led, monsieur. But for whose benefit? Ours or theirs? Miss Marple moved toward the hall door. Sometimes a chase is contrived to distract, but sometimes it reveals hidden paths. Poirot followed, Edward close behind. They stepped back into the corridor, then Miss Marple stopped abruptly. Look, she whispered. Along the baseboard, barely visible in the lantern glow, ran a faint smear of something dark, wet, and fresh. Ink, Poirot murmured. The same used on the decoy spoon. Someone with ink-stained fingers was here. He looked sharply at Edward. Your uncle used ink constantly, but he is deceased, yet someone continues his habits. Edward frowned. Who else writes constantly, uses ink daily? Miss Marple answered without hesitation. A housekeeper managing accounts, and a maid forced to obey orders. Poirot nodded grimly. So, Mrs. Green or Alice or both handled ink shortly before this. He traced the smeared trail. It continued down the corridor and vanished near a tapestry. Miss Marple lifted her lantern higher. Oh my, she whispered. This tapestry is not hanging quite straight. Someone moved it recently. Edward approached. It's been here for decades. We never touch it. Poirot stepped closer, running his fingertip along the edge. The tapestry hung loosely, too loosely. Then he found it. A gap, a thin slit along the wall's edge. Aha! Poirot exclaimed softly. A hidden door. Edward's eyes widened. A hidden door here? But why would... Miss Marple touched the rough. Stone behind the tapestry. Old estates often have passages, for servants, for secrecy, or for escape. Poirot pressed the concealed latch, and with a soft click, the panel released. Behind it lay darkness, cold, silent, waiting. Poirot lifted his lantern and stepped inside. The passage was narrow, the stone walls rough and damp. Cobwebs clung to corners, and the air smelled of earth and age. The floor sloped gently downward. Edward swallowed. I didn't know this existed. Someone did, Miss Marple said. And someone used it tonight, Poirot added. They entered the passage. The door closed behind them with a muted thud. For a moment, Edward froze. Did it just lock? Poirot tested the panel. No latch, no catch, just smooth stone. It appears, Poirot said with calm irritation, that we are not the first to go through here, nor the first to be trapped. Miss Marple looked ahead into the darkness. Then we must follow the way forward. Someone wants us to see what lies ahead. A faint echo reached them. A cry. Distant. Muffled. Frightened. Alice. Edward surged forward, but Poirot caught his sleeve. Non, monsieur. Slowly. We do not know what traps await. Douze. They walked cautiously, lanterns casting long, trembling shadows. The passage twisted left, then right, descending gradually. Water dripped from the ceiling, echoing like footsteps following them. Miss Marple's voice was low but steady. These tunnels were built a long time ago, likely by your ancestors. They used such passages during troubled times. Poirot added, and now someone uses them again for troubled purposes. Another cry echoed clearer this time. Not Alice. A man. Edward's face drained of colour. No, it can't be. Poirot stiffened. Mr. Langdon, your Uncle Henry? Edward shook his head violently. Impossible. He's dead. Miss Marple laid a hand on his arm. Dead men do not cry out, Edward, but frightened men do. Someone else is here. Poirot nodded grimly. Someone who needs our help, or wishes us to believe he does. They pressed on. At last, the passage opened into a larger chamber, an underground room with a low ceiling and walls of ancient stone. A lantern flickered weakly in the corner, and, on the floor, bound at the wrists, lay a man. Unconscious. Edward gasped. That's... Poirot raised his lantern. The man's face came into view. Good heavens, Miss Marple whispered. It was Henry Langdon, very much alive, but battered, bruised, breathing. Edward staggered back. I buried him. We held a funeral. Poirot knelt. Your uncle did not die, monsieur. He was made to disappear. Miss Marple's eyes moved quickly around. The chamber. Someone wanted the family and the world to believe he was dead, and someone has been keeping him here. Edward trembled. But why? Poirot examined Henry's bruised wrists. Because he knew the secret of the silver spoon, and someone wanted him silenced. Miss Marple moved her. Lantern across the walls. Look there. Papers littered a stone table. Letters, maps, diary pages. Henry's work. The truth he had been uncovering. Poirot turned sharply. We must free him quickly. The person who trapped him here may return. Edward dropped to his knees. Uncle Henry, uncle. Then, behind them, the sound of a door closing echoed through the chamber. Miss Marple turned. Her face hardened. We are not alone. Poirot stood. Indeed, he murmured, and our jailer has arrived. For long moments, silence filled the chamber, thick, suffocating, alive with tension. Only the faint flicker of lantern light illuminated the stone walls and the unconscious figure of Henry Langdon. Poirot raised his lantern higher, scanning the shadows that stretched beyond the archway. Show yourself, he said calmly, voice not rising but gaining sharpness. You have brought us here. Now we have arrived. What next? A dry, brittle laugh drifted from the far corner. Not a cruel laugh. A weary, resigned one. Miss Marple moved closer to Edward, steadying him with a gentle hand. Edward, prepare yourself. Whoever comes now has lived far too long in fear. And then the figure stepped forward. Mrs. Green. Her face was pale, her eyes red as though from recent tears. She held no weapon, not even a lantern. She looked as though the very weight of the house had come to rest upon her shoulders. Edward's voice cracked. Mrs. Green, you? You did this? She swallowed. Hard, her voice trembling. Not all of it. Poirot's gaze hardened. But enough. You lured us. You controlled Alice. You staged the spoon's appearances. Mrs. Green shut her eyes. I never meant to hurt anyone, only to protect the family, protect Willowbank. Miss Marple studied her closely. Protect it from what, my dear? Mrs. Green pointed shakily at the unconscious Henry Langdon. From him. Edward recoiled. My uncle? Mrs. Green nodded. Poirot stepped forward, his tone sharp. Explain. Now. Mrs. Green drew a shuddering breath. Your Uncle Henry, she began, discovered things he should not have. Old documents, illegal transactions, land deeds your great-grandfather forged decades ago. Willowbank sits partly on land that was never rightfully ours. Your uncle wanted to confess everything, return what was stolen. He said the family must face the consequences. Miss Marple nodded quietly. An honourable man. Mrs. Green's voice rose, hysterical. An honourable fool. What do you think would have happened? The estate broken apart? The Langdon name ruined? Everything gone. Edward stared. So you locked him away? Mrs. Green shook, her head violently. Not alone. Someone else helped me. Poirot's eyes narrowed. Who? She hesitated, then whispered, I cannot say. Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice soft yet firm. Mrs. Green, if you continue protecting this person, you will condemn yourself entirely. Tears streamed down Mrs. Green's cheeks. I thought we could keep him hidden until the new heir settled everything. Then perhaps we'd release him with some story. Edward was trembling. So I was to inherit a house built on lies. Poirot's tone softened only a fraction. You did not know. But someone else did. Miss Marple approached Henry gently. Poor man. Imprisoned for months. It's a wonder he's alive. Poirot knelt beside him. He must have been kept alive by someone sympathetic. Food, water, perhaps Alice? Mrs. Green looked guilty. Alice brought him things. She didn't know who he was. I told her he was a distant tenant, fallen ill. She obeyed. Poirot rose. But the spoon, madame, why use it to terrorize Clara, to frighten the entire household? Mrs. Green wrung her hands. I needed distractions, to keep eyes away from here. And Clara, she was meddling in old papers, just like Helena did, just like Henry. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Helena wasn't cursed, was she? She uncovered the truth long ago about the land, about the family's deception. Mrs. Green's voice was barely a whisper. She confronted the great-grandfather. He silenced her too. Not killed, but discredited. Branded her trouble. From then on, the spoon became the symbol of her rebellion, of danger. A warning. Poirot shook his head in disbelief. Generations of manipulation, a legend weaponized. Edward stared at the woman who had served his family all his life. Why? Didn't you tell me? I would have listened. No, Mrs. Green cried. If you had known, you might have done what your uncle tried. Confess everything. Bring down Willowbank. Miss Marple spoke gently. My dear, you've protected the wrong thing. Houses do not matter more than people. Walls don't. Matter more than truth. Mrs. Green sank to her knees. I only wanted to save us. Poirot folded his arms. Then tell us the final piece. You said someone else helped you. Who handled the real spoon? Mrs. Green covered her face. I can't. They will destroy everything if I speak. Poirot's voice turned cold. Madame, they already have. Henry stirred, then a soft moan escaping his lips. Edward rushed forward. Uncle Henry, it's Edward. You're safe now. Henry's cracked voice rasped. Edward, beware. Beware of... His eyes fell on Mrs. Green, then shifted past her, to the shadowed archway behind. Poirot turned sharply. Miss Marple gasped. Another figure stepped into the lantern light, slowly, deliberately. Someone they never expected. Edward whispered, No, it can't be. And Poirot's expression hardened into steel. At last, he said quietly, the true hand, behind the silver spoon. The real mastermind had arrived. And now the trap would finally spring. When morning finally broke over Willowbank Hall, the fog lifted, as if releasing the house from a long, suffocating grip. The police arrived to take statements, though Henry Langdon, weak but recovering, insisted on telling the full truth himself. Edward pledged to restore the stolen land and repair the family's tarnished history, a promise that brought a faint, grateful smile to his uncle's face. Clara, remorseful yet relieved, prepared to leave Willowbank to rebuild her life away from the shadow of the estate. Mrs. Green was taken into custody, her loyalty twisted into tragedy, and as order slowly returned, Willowbank felt strangely lighter, as though its walls could breathe again. On the front steps, Miss Marple adjusted her hat, while Poirot smoothed his impeccable moustache. Another mystery solved, mademoiselle, Poirot murmured. Miss Marple smiled gently. Yes, she said, and perhaps a family saved as well. Together, they walked into the brightening day.